Good afternoon, and welcome to our third week of Faculty Perspectives. At this point in the summer, it's important to remind you of the requirements for these sessions to stay on track to complete introduction. In order to complete the basic requirements for introduction, students need to watch live or asynchronously 10 faculty perspectives of your choice and complete the reflection assignments on the community.uoregon.edu site for the entering class. Students who wish to earn 1 credit over the summer must select 20 faculty perspectives by first completing 2 full tracks of faculty perspectives. Those are 16 of the total 20 required talks. Then select 4 additional faculty perspectives talks from any of the remaining tracks. Complete your post-talk reflections for all 20 of the selected talks, and then complete 1 comprehensive summary reflecting on your learning from the tracks you completed. You can find these details in the community.uoregon.edu course for the entering class. Also, as a reminder for you students who are watching live in Zoom, we will have the last portion of our program dedicated to answering your live questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask your questions of our faculty who are here today. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our third presentation in the Innovation and Entrepreneurship track. Dr. Chavez will discuss media industries and how they adapt to a world that is becoming more ethnically, racially, and linguistically diverse. Welcome, Dr. Chavez.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak a little bit about the research that I do. I thought today...
We're excited to have you.
Thank you. I thought today I'd cover a few things. First, to talk a little bit about the professional and background, my personal background that I have. Also a little bit about the research that I do, the kinds of questions that I ask, but also how I conduct my research, the theories that I draw on, the kinds of methods that I use, and then finally how these things help to inform how I work with students, and then how I also engage the community, so that these research, teaching, and service are all in conversation with one another. So a little bit about the background that I have. So I was born in Southern California, grew up there, and when I was going to college in Southern California, I was actually a business major, studied marketing, and did that for 4 years, and then afterwards worked in the advertising industry. First at Los Angeles in an agency called Chiat Day, and then moved to San Francisco, and then to Boston, and then back to San Francisco, for about 10 years working in advertising. And my job as an advertising executive was to work with global brands and to help to figure out how advertising could help them compete in a very competitive marketplace. But one of the questions, because it's a really interesting kind of job where sometimes you're a lawyer, sometimes you're a business person, sometimes you're a social psychologist, sometimes you're an anthropologist, but I was really interested in the question of how culture industries understand the audiences that they're working with. So that became the question that I became more and more focused on. And then left the advertising industry and went to go pursue a doctorate at the University of Southern California, studying that very questions. How do advertising agencies understand audiences, particularly when those audiences aren't them? The people that create advertising tend to be highly educated. They tend to work in urban areas. And so trying to understand, again, the things that allow them to understand consumers, but also not understand particular kinds of consumers. So I did my dissertation on that work, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then got my first teaching job at St. Louis University in Missouri, where I was a professor of persuasive communications, worked there for about 3 years, and then had the opportunity to move here in our advertising department in the School of Journalism and Communication, and I've been a proud duck since 2012. So just a little bit about the research. As you mentioned, my main question is, how do media industries adapt to a world that's becoming more ethnically, racially, and linguistically diverse? So I had studied advertising and then studying, now taking that same question, but understanding different kinds of industries. And specifically those industries that create culture. So things like the film industry or the television industry or the news industry or the advertising industry. And again, I'll talk a little bit about this in more detail. But I'm also interested in how these industries are becoming more globally connected. Every year that goes by, fewer and fewer of these agencies are becoming more dominant. Fewer smaller players are leaving the marketplace, and so it becomes much more of a dominant force. But also the factors that both impede and promote ability to adapt. And this is actually an interesting moment to examine this question because we're living in a moment of huge disruption. So it's going to be interesting to see the kind of players that will thrive, survive, and then not survive in this kind of environment of change. And then finally, my particular interest is on globalization and its impact on marginalized communities. So within a more globalized world, more and more people are winners. Some are losers in this kind of environment because there are huge inequities that are at play. So some people don't benefit from the process and some people benefit very well. There's also a huge concentration of wealth, which leads to some of these disparities. So two areas that I wanted to just reemphasize a bit. One is culture, which for ages was a local phenomenon. The clothes that we wore, the music that we listened to, how we articulated, the way that we spoke, all were locally grounded, whether it was through the community or the village or the nation state. Today, more and more of those very things are mediated now by a handful of corporations, the music industry, the fashion industry, the news industry. And so what a college student today in the US, here in Eugene, is probably listening to very similar things from a college student that's in New York, or even a college student that's in London or Madrid or in Colombia. And so these handful of corporations are really mediating how we experience culture, the rituals, our customs. And every year, again, these companies get bigger and bigger. And because of consolidation within the industry, fewer and fewer players are having a disproportionately amount of impact on the culture and how we consume it. So it's a really interesting, fascinating time for study. The second thing, all of this is tied to the larger issue of globalization. And again, hearing the tensions between very, very global dynamics and local dynamics. A few years back, I had an opportunity to teach in Madrid. And Spain's one of those really interesting countries where there's a lot going on. The idea of a national Spain, for example, is a relatively new phenomenon. Even now that you see some of these tensions play out, where there are parts of Catalonia that are exerting their independence, their unique culture, their unique language, but yet we think of it as a unified country with a unified language, even though there are really these interesting local tensions that happen there. So when I was there, this is a picture of the Puerta del Sol, one of the plazas within Spain, and it was hugely during the time of these inequities. And so one of the things that we noticed here is that the encroachment of capitalism, more and more companies that were infiltrating Spanish life, also benefiting some but not benefiting all people in Spain. And so they took to the plaza to really express their disaffection with this moment. And so this moment was happening in the US, it was also happening all over the world. And so these questions aren't unique necessarily to one particular place, but they're questions that are being asked in different kinds of cultural contexts. So when I talk about globalization, I'm really talking about three main facets that we're living through right now. So primarily expedited flows of capital. So the financial interdependence that we have right now at this moment, where something happens in a market in Europe, profoundly impacts what's happening here in the United States and vice versa. Companies now are becoming bigger than the nation state or bigger than a particular place. So a company like Disney is no longer just in Anaheim or in Florida or in Burbank. It is a global company that is bigger than the US. It has global ambitions. So there's an amount of capital that's flowing back and forth all over the world. The second is expedited flows of information, so communications technology. So this is a perfect moment, and here I am sitting in a room in Eugene, Oregon, and people can access this all over the country, if not all over the world, and it happens instantaneously. The whole idea of time and space has been completely collapsed. And then finally, the expedited flow of bodies, right? People are crossing borders at an expedited rate, largely a result of displacement or political turmoil or economic turmoil or financial opportunity. But the flow of bodies across borders has been unprecedented. And again, this has always been part of the world experience, part of the human experience, but the degree to which that's happening has expedited in recent years. And again, I call attention to this particular moment of time because in the age of COVID-19, all of this stuff has stopped to some degree. Not necessarily communications, but the migration. It's much harder now to move freely in this particular moment of time. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this moment plays out and the long-term effects moving forward. So these are really kind of the key themes that draw some of the work that I do together. As I'd mentioned, the work that I do in graduate school was focused on the advertising industry. So my particular question there was how the advertising industry understood, or in some ways didn't understand, the Latino consumer, despite its growing presence, or our growing presence in the economy. But again, you have a community that is pretty homogenous, creating advertising for a world that is becoming more diverse. And it's very ill-equipped to do that. The first book that I edited was one that was based a lot of the work that I did in Madrid, Spain. So we had scholars all over the world confronting the issue of globalization and communications. So we had chapters on Iranian bloggers, to Jewish matchmakers, to Spanish football players who were resisting a unified Spain during the Franco era. But it was really one of those interesting moments where you had scholars from all over the world. In fact, I was the only US-based scholar that contributed to this anthology. So for me, it's one of the works that I'm most proud of, just because of the collection we were able to bring together. And then my anthology, which was working on the television industry and understanding the collapse between what had been primarily two separate industries: a general market industry that that most people consume, that is English monolingual, and a Hispanic television industry that is primarily in Spanish. But now you're seeing a collapsing of those linguistic borders and new kinds of combinations that are happening in in the television industry. So again, those are the kinds of themes that I do. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the work that I do, how I conduct my research. When I first did my dissertation back in graduate school, I knew that industry inside out. I had spent about 10 years working as an ad executive in that industry. I knew the players, I knew the logic by which it operated. And in some ways it was easy, just because I knew it so intimately. I think the harder thing to do too, as part of that, is when you become so familiar with an industry, it's also hard to see it with fresh eyes, to see, because you see it from an insider's point of view. And so you want to look at it from a different kind of vantage point. My work since then has taken on new industries that I'm not as familiar with. So studying the television industry, and now that when I'm studying public radio, I don't know those industries as intimately as I did the advertising industry. So part of it is just understanding it inside and out, but also understanding it as a historical product. There's a French theorist named Pierre Bourdieu, and he talks about scholarship and how you always have to look at it from a historical perspective. Otherwise, you're just merely looking at a snapshot in a particular moment in time. But you have to understand how these industries developed, how what you see today is a historical product, and it also informs where it's going. So it gives you more of a 360-degree view on a particular industry. My work typically is grounded in a couple of different theories, but primarily critical political economy. So looking at the way that industries are organized, the economic goals that they have. And so understanding, say for example, the music industry is understanding it as a dual product. You're understanding it as a cultural product, something that produces music, that brings in artists, that has artistic endeavors, but at the same time it's also a business, that it has particular economic goals that it's trying to meet, particular markets that it's trying to appeal to. And so that informs the kind of music that we hear and the kind of artists that we get to listen to. In a world full of infinite possibilities, why is it that we only hear a handful of artists singing about a handful of subjects? So those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. But I'm also interested in language, how all of this impacts language. And again, thinking about the diversity of culture, the range of music that we listen to, the range of possibilities with clothing and rituals, how we express ourselves, and yet only a really small, narrow slice of culture gets to be promoted, and it promoted very, very aggressively. And for me, human speech is one of those. One of the most beautiful things is the diversity of the human language and the different kinds of accents that we have. But now more and more you're starting to see a standardization of language, a regression, especially towards English monolingualism. And so the diversity of human language is now becoming standardized and codified and unified towards a single kind of way of speaking, a single culture. And so those are the kind of tensions that I'm really interested in. In terms of methodology, what I love to do is just dive right into it, especially with an industry that you don't know anything about. And so just diving in, understanding everything about it. And so I'll begin really by reading everything that I can. So I'll start with the literature itself, everything that's been written on the television industry, where it's going. And then once I start to zero in on a particular kind of facet within that industry, digging into public records, industry reports, strategic documents, journalistic accounts. And so that gives me a better picture of how the industry operates, again, where it came from, how it operated. And then I'll also spend a lot of time interviewing practitioners working within these industries. So the people, especially at a senior level, that are making key strategic decisions within these organizations, and then to ask them from a fresh point of view, what has capital, what has currency within their field, to explain particular kinds of decisions and how they happen. But I also, if possible, try to spend more time in the actual environment. So in the newsrooms, in the planning sessions, in the advertising agencies, and to see the dynamics that are happening there. It's been a bit more difficult these past couple of months, just because there, again, as I mentioned, there is no mobility. So that's been both a problem and an opportunity. I think it's been a challenge because it's not easy now to go into these environments because people aren't spending time in their offices. But on the plus side, people have a lot of expendable time these days. And so I've been able to have a lot of important Zoom conversations and interviews with folks that I wouldn't otherwise have gotten. So it's presented both opportunities and then hindrances. So probably the current work that I'm working on right now is a good example of this. This was an industry that I didn't know a whole lot about, but the idea of a publicly funded radio system. And the idea itself goes back to the 1930s, but National Public Radio, which is what we mostly are familiar with, it's the largest publicly funded radio network in the country, is really only about 50 years old. It started in 1970, but the idea of a national public radio raises really interesting questions for me, because as a national public radio system, it purports claims about what it means to be American, but also who gets to be American. So it suggests that it's meant for the people, but then it becomes a question of, well, who is the people? Who gets to listen? Who gets to be targeted? Who are being included in this, this construction of who they design as the audience? And one of the things that you find when you dive into the literature and you dive into the strategic reports is that they're not actually talking to the public writ large. They're actually talking to a very narrow segment of the audience. And part of that is because of their economic funding model. They were never really publicly funded, so every year they have to go to Congress to get an appropriation, or every so often to get an appropriation. So they've had to rely heavily on individual subscribers, corporate sponsorships, and the other kinds of foundation subsidies. And so they're constantly trying to deliver an audience to these funding sources. And typically, and this has been true from day one until where we are today, they've typically targeted an audience of educated, affluent audiences, and also an audience that has been primarily white. And what that's done is shifted away from its original model to serve the most disenfranchised, the most marginalized listener. And so these are folks that haven't been included typically in public radio. On the other hand, so you've had this system, and this is true of many culture industries, that operates according to its logic, that tends to replicate itself. It's hard to get very heavy culture industries to change, but at the same time, the country and the world is changing dramatically because of these flows of information and because of the flows of migration. The country will look very different in 10 years than it does today, and in 50 years, certainly, it will be a post-white America in which most of the population will not be white, even though these advertising industries and these public radio industries and television industries are creating content for the same audiences. And so really interested in, and that's a fact, right? And so that's not really the question is whether they do or not. The question is why don't they? Because it's already a kind of an established fact that they do not serve these audiences very well. And in fact, right now, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's renewed conversations and critique around the role of journalism and how it's perpetuated biases. But the question is what are the practices that inhibit journalism and public radio to adapt to these kinds of changes? And then again, to re-engage its original mandate, which was to engage listeners civically, but also to represent the diversity of the nation. Those were built into its original mission. The original architects of NPR had decided that was primarily what it was going to be about, and it has deviated from that mission. So again, that has been established. It's more of the whys and the hows of that, why that has been established. So again, using that model of how to dive into it, it's learning a new industry. Again, public radio was not something that I knew intimately well. We have journalism students in our program, and so it was working with them a little bit, but it was meant really diving into an industry from the beginning and understanding its history, where it came from, its precursor beginning in the 1930s, and that meant diving into the literature. So reading everything that had been written about that I could on public radio and America's public radio system, but also uncovering the historical documents. What were the documents, the legislation that led to the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 that then set up NPR and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS, and then also strategic documents. All of these are generally publicly available. So understanding, again, the logic, and oftentimes what you find is that there's almost two different kinds of conversations that are going on. There's the conversation in which the media organization tries to speak to the public, and it's a very benign face. But then there's the conversations, the real conversations that happen to legislators or to stakeholders or to potential funders. And it's a very different kind of conversation that's happening. Both of them are very revealing, but oftentimes they're not exactly congruent. So sometimes, again, understanding strategic documents and understanding, again, the very clear logic by which public radio has organized itself can shed light on what we're listening to, the kind of podcasts that we hear, the kind of news that gets to be covered. And so I started this project about 4 years ago. It takes a long time, again, to know an industry pretty intimately. But then I also spent time with everybody that would basically give me the time of day. I've spent time with journalists, producers, hosts, voice coaches, editors, executives at NPR, the former heads of Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And people were very, very generous with their time and their insight. Again, asking them questions and just understanding how they do their work. And that's something that can become very, very revealing. And in some cases, people can be very guarded. They're not inclined to be critical of the organizations that they, especially if they're working for currently. But in some kinds, people are very, very open and generous with their insight, and even critical and reflective about their work that they're doing. And that's when you know you have a very good kind of interview, when you get people to reveal themselves and to reveal their practices, and then get them to be critical and reflective about the work that they do. So that's the kind of research that I do. So I just finished the book manuscript, hoping to work with publishers. So that would be the next step, is to get it published. But then there's the whole other facet of it. And so the work that I do tends to speak to two different kinds of audiences. The first is an academic audience. So the product of that research will be primarily an academic book that speaks to either academics or practitioners that are working in this area that might be used in classrooms. There's also journal articles. But I also try to speak to more of a public audience and then to a trade audience. And so this is a piece that came out from the research on language. And so one of the questions that I was asking, particularly in this one, is how NPR, for example, standardizes language. Because it's, especially from when it came from, represented the diversity of the country. And if you listen to how people speak all across the country, they have these beautiful accents, whether you come from the Bronx or from Brooklyn or from Southern California or Alabama, people just have these rich, beautiful accents. But when you listen to public radio, it's a very standardized, neutral way of speaking. And it's always English, and it's English monolingualism. And so there's not a lot of tolerance for other languages, even though these languages flourish and are widely used across the Americas, but particularly in the nation. And so I was really interested in that question of whose stories and voices are left out when you standardize language to that degree. And so this was an article that ran in Current, which is essentially the de facto trade publication of public media industry. But I wanted to get it in front of their eyes so that at least we can broaden up the conversation for the people that actually work in these industries, and not just an academic audience, people that have more of a kind of a narrow focus. And so the idea is to bring it out to a wider audiences. And so that's some of the work that I'll try to do, is try to get the research out to a more public audience so that they can wrestle with some of these questions or confront some of these issues. So here are a couple of examples of some of the talks that I've been able to give. The top one was at a radio station in Ghana. This was during World Press Freedom Day, which we were trying to understand the state of journalism in the world. And it's embattled right now, and it's embattled here in the United States especially. So our students who are becoming journalists are coming into a very tough time, just because there's a lot of contention around journalism and what is news. You know, people not having the same credibility around journalism that there once was. And so we were wrestling with that question. And so they were asking in Ghana what the dynamics were in the United States during this moment of embattlement for journalists. And then I've also worked with a colleague, Dr. Peter Loffer, with Crossings Radio, which is an effort with UNESCO. And we put together a series of podcasts that confront some of these questions about cross-cultural communication, intercultural dialogue, and conflict-sensitive reporting. And so we'll try to address issues through podcasting as a way to address some of these questions that are going on right now. Some of it will be based on student research, and oftentimes we'll work with journalism students to get involved in that. And then I also was more recently invited to our NPR station, KLCC, to talk about race, media, identity, and journalism and representation at this moment in time again. And so I got to work with a couple of colleagues there to talk about this issue live on the radio. And so again, the goal is to take some of these questions beyond a limited audience that can be within scholarship, and then to broaden up the conversations. And they're very, very, I feel, very important and relevant conversations that we're having right now at this moment in time, and especially again with what we're going through with this huge moment of disruption. So this will in turn shape how I then engage students. And typically I'll work with two different kinds of students, undergraduate students, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work that I do as doctoral program director. So because we're a professional school in a liberal arts university, we are working with advertising students, students that will go on to become journalists, students that will go on to become public radio practitioners and PR practitioners. And so it tends to be very hands-on, production-oriented. And again, because my work tends to be more globally focused, we'll take them all over the world to do these kind of things. And so we've taken, every spring, we'll take a group of students, about 100 students, to advertising agencies in New York during Creative Week. And they get to see big agencies, they'll see small agencies, they'll see media companies. We have a huge alumni base in New York, and so they're very generous with their time. And oftentimes we'll put our students that are current students into contact with our alum who are very well established there. And they're so generous with it. And you see just our students just really light up when they go through this experience. I've also done some work in Ghana. I went there for about 4 or 5 years. And so we've worked with nonprofit organizations, for example, health organizations, and understanding the people that are very key involved in telling their stories in terms of getting health messages out there for communities. We've also had kind of a youth journalism program at the World Press Freedom Days. These have happened in Ghana, in Accra. They've also happened in Indonesia, in Helsinki, in Tunis. And so we have them all over the world every year. And so we'll take a group of students who will conduct a journalism newsroom. And basically they're covering day by day because we have so many important speakers, heads of state, journalists that come to this event, and our students get these kinds of access they wouldn't have otherwise. And then we also have done working for wineries in Mendoza, Argentina. And so these students got to spend basically the day hanging out at a winery, shooting bottles of wine, filming the winery. And so it basically runs the gamut of the kind of work that we do there. But it's, again, very production oriented. We try to make it very experiential as much as possible, and to make sure that students are going to get skill sets, that they're taking something away from it, that they're learning something tangible about culture and globalization and business, but at the same time they can take something tangible and use it in their portfolio, which will then become an important part of how they sell themselves as brands in a competitive marketplace. And so we want them to take something tangible in their portfolios that they can then, again, get the jobs, because our students are entering a very, very competitive marketplace. And then finally, my work is a little bit different. I'm the doctoral program director at the School of Journalism Communication. We recruit students from all over the world. particularly the global south. So we have students from Palestine, from Pakistan, from Ghana, from Ethiopia, from Latin America, and domestic students. And so our relationship there is a little bit different because we're primarily invested in ensuring that their scholarship moves forward because they have questions. They're asking questions about how to develop effective global health campaigns, or they're asking questions about how CEOs across the world use their platforms as a form of social activism, or how indigenous communities can use cryptocurrency as a way to gain rights and sovereignty. And so they're asking really important, relevant, and timely questions. And so our goal as faculty is to work with them to ensure that they have the resources and the mentorship that they have to go on then and produce great work and to contribute to that form of knowledge. And that's kind of relationship that lasts a lifetime. We think of them as colleagues, and we'll continue to work with these folks indefinitely throughout our careers. And so they're generally here for 4 to 5 years, but we get to work with them, and it's probably one of my favorite parts of the jobs. So I'm in the lucky position that I get to work with 2 different groups of students in very, very kind of interesting and dynamic kinds of ways, and that we get to travel the world doing that. So that's a little bit about the work that I do, and I'm happy to answer any kind of questions, but thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chavez. We do have some questions that have come in from students. So I want to start with Ryan's question. Ryan wants to know, how is COVID-19 impacting globalization? What do you think globalization looks like for the future?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. So I think, one, there's going to be an economic restraint. So just companies have stopped doing business. In some ways, smaller companies, and we're seeing that, just they're closing shop. The retail industry, the restaurant industry. So I think there's going to be a slowing down of kind of the economic portion of it, and we're all kind of waiting to see how big that's going to be. But there's also been a big restriction in terms of migration. Some of that is health related, some of it is politically related, but people just aren't getting on planes. It's getting much harder for people to get visas. And so I think we're going to see kind of a constraining of movement across borders. Again, we don't know if that's necessarily going to be a hiccup, if it's a short-term thing, or if there's going to be long, profound effects on that. But that certainly is going to have an impact. On the other end, the communications technology, gosh, that's been able to create new opportunities for us. And so I taught a class, a graduate class, which would have typically been a seminar class through Zoom. And so Zoom's all of a sudden become this cultural phenomenon that nobody really knew much about before then. And now we're all kind of beholden to it. So in that area, time and space has been collapsed a bit.
Thank you for that. So an anonymous question that's come in, how has your global experience and knowledge impacted the way you teach?
I try to bring those experiences to the classroom all the time. And we get a group of students, we get different kinds. So a lot of them come from Oregon, so they're very locally based. Some of those students may not have traveled outside of Oregon or across the country extensively. And then we get groups of students that come from over the country, and then we get a certain amount of students that come from all over the world. And so to try to bring these experiences and make them real and tangible for them, so that we can use through examples. So that when we look at advertising, for example, we're not just looking at US-oriented advertising. That advertising in Singapore looks really different. They're using really different kinds of emotions. Or Spanish language advertising, which again has a different kind of appeal. So they get a broader base. I think our ultimate goal is that we know that chances are our students aren't going to stay and work in Eugene. They're going to either go to a big city that's going to be a lot more globally connected, or to New York, which is super globally connected, or they're going to go abroad. And so that's the kind of student that we're really preparing them for, is that they have the cultural sensitivity, the savvy, the know-how to thrive and operate in a globally connected world. And I think that's one of our strong goals. We also do that in trying to promote experiential learning. So many of our students take advantage of study abroad programs. They'll study in London, they'll go to Sri Lanka, they'll go to New Zealand. With students, I've taken them to Spain and to Argentina. And so many of our students will take advantage of that opportunity. And when they come back transformed. They just have a much broader perspective, and that's what we hope for.
Thank you for that. So I know experiential learning is a pillar for the work happening in the School of Journalism and Communication. And you gave several examples. Can you talk about the skill development and the career readiness these opportunities offer to students?
Yeah, so probably a good example would be the study abroad that we did in Argentina. And so the goal was to show that the tension so kind of thinking there was a theoretical component and there was a very practical component. And the idea was to marry these things completely. So the theoretical component was what we've been talking about, globalization of culture, the tension between local, like what's very, very specifically Argentine, but then these industries that are becoming more global, and then the focus around a particular commodity or an industry that kind of illustrates that. And so we chose the wine industry. And so Argentina, one of the products that they export abroad is wine. So they're known for their Malbecs especially. And so we partnered with a winery that was based in Mendoza, Argentina. It's right at the foot of the Andes. And really use that as a way to understand kind of local culture, local tastes, local geography. We were based in Rosario, which is a little bit different than Buenos Aires. And so the restaurants that you would go to, there weren't a lot of Starbucks, there weren't a lot of these chains. And students really got to feel a place that was very, very locally situated. They were staying in these homes, but they really got to have an experience that was very locally grounded. And at the same time, we were talking about globalization. And then we went to Mendoza, and then that's where the actual production got into it. So we had videographers, we had photographers, we had people that were researchers, we had people that were editors, animators. And so what they did is each one took on the role and we tried to play to their strengths. And so basically we spent a couple of days at this winery and they were capturing footage. They were getting these great assets and then they created videos. And these videos were used on behalf of the organization of our partner, but our students were able to use them as basically evidence that they could go in and, heck, I could shoot a film, I could shoot a short film, I could create an advertisement, I could copyright, I could design. And so they were doing really tangible work, but we use this theoretical lens in order to have a good conversation between practice and theory.
So a question from me, because I like to steal questions occasionally, but I supervise a number of students each year through the ambassador program and the orientation leaders, and so we get to hear about the New York trip quite a bit because a lot of advertising students want to be student ambassadors, and it seems to be a transformative experience for those students. They always come back to even more in love with advertising and with big goals and big plans. But I'm sure from your perspective, you have some favorite stories from one of those trips to New York. Do you have something that sort of stands out, either an epiphany a student had or a person they met or a network connection that seemed to be made that helped secure a student's future in the field?
Absolutely. So we take about 100 students, and it started off small and then has over time grown bigger and bigger. So I think we started maybe with 20 and then went to 50, and I think now it's a little over 100. And the students are just so professional, and we prepare them almost a term in advance on how to just be good citizens while they're there, because they're going into businesses, and they really represent us tremendously well. So I've been doing this a long enough time where you see students go through the experience and their eyes are wide open. And so you'll actually get a range of students. Like some people, again, just cannot see themselves in New York because it can be a lot. But other people just fall in love with the city. They said, I need to be here. And then they'll go out and they'll get a job in New York, and then I'll see them the next year. And something happens in that year's time where they become more New York than New York. Like they are on top of it, and they look so sharp, and they're so poised, and most of all, they're mostly generous with our students. And so you start to see kind of layers and layers of this history, because you remember them as students that were unsure about their place in the industry, about their place in the world, and then they become these confident professionals. And they're so poised, and they're so just on top of their game. And then again, they turn around, they're so generous with the current students. And so just seeing them develop over time, and then they become more senior in their career. And so I think for me, that's the most rewarding. There's generally a moment where we'll take one time during the week and we have all the ducks get together. And it's just this beautiful moment where you see people that have graduated 7 years ago and 5 years ago with current students. And again, it's just a lot of generosity and empathy that I witnessed there. And so for me, that's the favorite point during the trip.
Thank you for that. Arian wants to know, does Professor Chavez, you, approach big questions and answer them in the field of public advertising?
So I haven't yet, but I have colleagues that are starting to understand that, just because I think the industry is changing a lot right now, and then the media industry is changing a lot as well. So as media industries, particularly journalism, is becoming more economically strapped, they're trying to find other revenue sources. So I think they're experimenting with different kinds of advertising models, and then also trying to understand the role of advertising in terms of addressing public issues. So we have a program within within the School of Journalism Communication called Advertising and Brand Responsibility, which examines that question of, to what degree should corporations and can corporations be public citizens and good public citizens, since they're operating in the world and they are creating culture. And so how can they be more responsible about engaging some of these questions? And so we have a master's program that's dealing with that issue right now.
Thank you. Okay, so let's see. I've got a couple more here that I want to make sure that we get to. What role do you believe advertisers have in shaping a global political economy? What do you think needs to happen to expand the diversity of the advertising industry?
Yeah, and that's one of those things that I think has been an issue even since when I got into the industry in 1993. So I was often the only Latino in the room. And so that's really prompted a lot of the questions that I had. And here we are, 30, 40 years later, and it hasn't changed all that much. The advertising is still confronting diversity issues. And I guess I'll add that it's not necessarily just the advertising industry. Any kind of exclusive institution, even the university, even the journalism industry, it just becomes a trope that I see again and again. They know that they have to diversify, they just don't know how, or how do you change your practices to allow that. And so I think it's just a tremendous disruption that's happening until you have a moment in which people, the demographics certainly will prompt that. Again, our demographics are changing so quickly that I have to believe that at some point the industry is going to have to respond. But one of the things that I found is that they're hugely committed to the status quo in the face of disruption and change. And so I think that's, for me, one of the things that I've been most surprised in my research is how it's in their best interest to diversify, not just because it's a moral responsibility, because it makes good business sense, but yet these industries cannot or do not or will not.
Thank you. That's all the time that we have. I feel like I could ask you questions all day, but we do want to make sure that students know, students, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. If you have questions regarding this or any other introduction program, you can visit our website at orientation.uoregon.edu. You can always email us at orientation@uoregon.edu or text us your questions at 541-346-1159. If you submitted a question that we didn't answer, I think we got to most of them, but if we didn't answer your question, we will follow up with you early next week. Thank you so much, Professor Chavez, for sharing your insights, your experience, your research, and all the work that you're doing with our students, and for sharing your knowledge with our new ducks. I'm sure they're very excited to take classes with you.
Thank you very much. And if you make it here in the fall, please come by and see me. Thank you.